What if I told you that right now, sitting in a little paper packet on a shelf in some hardware store, a tiny vegetable seed is literally breathing?
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
Right, like it is actively burning through a finite microscopic battery of energy just to stay alive. And if you wait too long to put it in the ground, it won't just fail to sprout. It will actually, well, starve to death.
It's basically suffocating in slow motion. I mean, we tend to look at seeds as inanimate objects, right?
Oh, completely. Just like little pebbles.
Exactly. We treat them like pebbles or marbles that you can just toss in a kitchen drawer for a decade. But they are living organisms. They're just waiting for an incredibly specific environmental cue to wake up.
Which completely shatters this idea we have of farming in nature. I mean, if you look at a skyscraper, you see the engineering, you see the blueprints and the load-bearing math.
The architecture of it all.
Yeah, the architecture. But when you step out of the city and look at a farm, we tend to assume nature is just this wild, organic, messy thing. Like you throw a seed in the dirt, it rains, and suddenly you get a tomato.
Right. The assumption is always that nature does all the heavy lifting and the farmer just sort of guides it along. But the reality is far more calculated.
It's incredibly calculated, and that's what we're looking at today. We're doing a deep dive into a sixth-grade textbook called Zarai Talim, which translates from Urdu to agricultural education. It's used in Punjab, Pakistan.
It's a fascinating source.
Honestly, reading through this completely changed my perspective.
Yeah.
Because this deep dive is all about the heavily refined science of how food is grown and how land is managed.
And whether you're a dedicated city dweller whose only interaction with nature is a struggling houseplant,
Guilty as charged?
or if you actually have a green thumb, understanding the exact science behind the food on your plate is going to change how you view a simple vegetable or even a glass of milk.
Because this isn't just a simple, how to plant a bean guide.
No, not at all.
It's a curriculum that distills thousands of years of survival, biology, and high-stakes problem-solving into a format meant for 12-year-olds.
Which is just incredible when you see the level of detail they go into.
Okay, let's unpack this because, you can't grow anything without the right foundation. We have to begin at the literal ground level to understand the microscopic environment required to sustain life.
The soil.
Right, the soil. According to the text, the absolute perfect balance of soil isn't just dirt. It is a strict mathematical formula.
And it is very strict.
Yes, 45% minerals, 5% organic matter, so like dead leaves or manure, 25% water, and 25% air.
That last metric, the 25% air, is really the linchpin of the whole operation.
It's empty space.
Exactly. A quarter of your perfect soil needs to be literal empty space.
But wait, if a quarter of the ground is just empty space, what happens when there's a torrential downpour? Doesn't the water just push all that air out?
Well, that is the exact vulnerability farmers are constantly managing. And the textbook actually outlines different soil types to explain this mechanism.
Right.
So think about sandy soil. It has massive, coarse particles. If you pour water on sand, it rushes right through because the empty spaces are too big.
Right. It drains instantly.
Yeah, the water moves too fast for the roots to actually drink.
It's like trying to hold water in a sieve.
That's a perfect way to put it. But on the opposite end, you have clay soil. Now, clay particles are microscopic and they're flat.
So they pack together.
Exactly. They stack together so tightly that they trap the water. So when that torrential downpour hits clay, the water pools, it can't drain, and that crucial 25% airspace is completely pushed out.
Wow. So the roots just sit in water.
They do, and the roots of your crops are effectively drowned.
Because they can't breathe.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess, what brings us to the Goldilocks zone the textbook focuses on.
Right, Loam. Or as it's locally called, ball.
Ball. It's this harmonious mixture of sand, clay, and silt. The text says if you grab a handful of ball, it should feel slightly crumbly but still hold its shape if you squeeze it.
Kind of like perfectly damp sand at the beach.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, you know what it reminds me of? It's like baking a delicate cake.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Yeah, like if you put too much flour in, which would be the clay, it makes a dense brick. But if you use too much baking powder, the sand, it just crumbles apart.
That is exactly the dynamic. You need the structural integrity, but also the lightness.
Right. But to know if your field actually has this perfect ratio, you have to sample it. And the book points out that you can't just scoop up a handful from the top.
No, because the topsoil doesn't tell you what the roots will experience months from now when they grow deeper.
Right. So the text describes a very specific V-shaped cut you have to dig into the earth. For standard crops, you dig a V shape about 15 centimeters deep. But if you're planting fruit trees, you have to dig a massive 125 centimeters deep.
which is pretty deep.
It's huge. But why does it have to be a V shape? Why not just dig a hole?
Well, think about the geometry of digging a hole. If you just dig straight down, your shovel scrapes and compresses the sides, right?
Oh, so you're smearing the dirt.
Exactly. You're mixing the layers of dirt together. A V-shaped wedge allows you to pull out a clean, undisturbed cross-section of the earth.
Okay, that makes sense.
You can literally read the layers of the soil profile like pages in a book.
So you see exactly where the loam ends and the clay begins.
Yes. And the depth difference is vital here. A standard seasonal crop has shallow roots. It only interacts with that top 15 centimeters.
But a fruit tree is different.
Very different. A fruit tree is a long-term investment. Its roots will anchor deep for decades. So if you don't check a meter down and there's a dense layer of impenetrable clay hiding down there, well...
It's a ticking time bomb.
Exactly. Your tree will grow beautifully for 2 years, hit that clay barrier, the water will pool, and the tree dies from the roots up.
Wow. It's literally laying the foundation of a building.
It really is.
But let's go back to the seed itself, because this blew my mind. The textbook states that a seed must be under 1 year old to be planted, or it loses its germination power.
Which surprises a lot of people.
Yeah. I have to push back on this a little bit. Why is a seed considered dead after just a year? I mean, isn't it just a dormant capsule, like a little vault waiting to be opened?
Well, what's fascinating here is the sheer mechanics of dormancy.
Okay.
To wake up and germinate, a seed requires a precise triad of environmental cues: oxygen, temperature, and water.
Right.
While it waits for those cues, it uses oxygen to slowly metabolize its own microscopic starch reserves just to keep its cellular machinery intact.
Oh, wow. So if it sits in a shed for, say, 18 months,
Right, it burns through that internal starch battery.
it's running on fumes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By the time you finally put it in the perfect ball soil and add water, the seed simply doesn't have the caloric strength left to physically push its sprout out of the shell.
That is tragic.
It has the right environment, but no internal fuel.
The biological clock just literally runs out.
Yes.
And speaking of manipulating that environment, there's an incredibly clever trick in the book for planting these fresh seeds in pots.
Oh, the clay shard trick.
Yes. To preserve that delicate 25% water and 25% air ratio, you are instructed to place a curved shard of clay right over the drainage hole at the bottom of the pot.
It's analog engineering at its finest, honestly.
It's so simple, but so smart.
Because if you leave the pot's hole uncovered, every time you water your plant, your precious 45% mineral mixture washes right out the bottom.
You just lose your soil.
Right. But if you plug the hole completely, you create a clay-like swamp and suffocate the seed.
But placing a curved shard over it, it acts like a tiny umbrella. It lets the excess water escape around the edges, but the physical architecture of the soil stays completely inside the pot.
Because without that drainage, there is no aeration. The seed needs the empty air pockets in the soil to pull in oxygen and convert its food into energy.
No oxygen, no energy.
And no energy, no plant.
Okay, so let's say you nail the math. You have the perfect ballome, a fresh seed with a full internal battery, and the temperature is right. The seed breaches the surface. You've won.
Well, you've survived infancy. But the war is really just beginning.
Huh. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the nursery is safe, right? You control everything. But the natural ecosystem is incredibly hostile.
It's a battlefield out there.
Yeah, plants have to be ultimate survivors, and the text highlights the extreme botanical plasticity they use to master their environments. Take aquatic plants, for example, like the lotus.
The lotus is a masterclass in adaptation.
Because it's underwater.
Right. It lives in water, meaning its roots are buried in mud, where that 25% air ratio we talked about is practically zero.
Right. So how does it breathe?
To survive, the lotus develops hollow stems. It literally builds its own internal scuba diving tubes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it reaches up to the surface to capture air and transports it downward to the roots.
That is wild. And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have desert plants like cacti.
Exactly.
They adapt to environments where water is the absolute rarest commodity. They develop these thick, fleshy stems to hoard every single drop, and they push tough, aggressive roots deep into the dry earth to hunt for moisture.
It's pure survival.
But as harsh as the desert or the water is, the elements aren't actually the farmer's biggest problem.
No, they're not. The biggest problem is the competition.
The weeds. The textbook defines a weed simply as any unwanted plant competing for resources. And the numbers are terrifying.
Yeah, they are.
It says weeds are capable of destroying up to 50% of a crop's total yield. Half of the food you were relying on just wiped out by unwanted vegetation.
It's a massive, massive loss.
But reading this, I couldn't help but wonder, I mean, are weeds actually evil? Or are they just the ultimate botanical opportunists? Like, they sound like an invasive army, but they're just trying to survive too, right?
Biologically speaking, they are evolutionary marvels. I mean, they grow faster than domestic crops, they produce thousands more seeds, and they survive in much poorer soil.
So they're just better at being plants.
They're hyper efficient, but for a farmer trying to feed a population, they are a compounding threat.
Well, if these weeds are such massive resource hogs, absorbing all the water and blocking the sun, I imagine they also create dense little microclimates in the field, right? Doesn't that attract bugs?
That is the secondary threat, and it's a big one. A patch of weeds acts as a Trojan horse.
How so?
It provides a humid, sheltered safe haven for insects and fungal infections right next to your cash crop. The insects breed in the weeds, they multiply, and then they march directly into your wheat.
Oh, that's brutal.
Yeah, so the wheat doesn't just steal your water, it essentially launches a biological attack on your harvest.
Which means the farmer is fighting a constant multi-front war, and the enemies change with the calendar.
Yes, the seasonality is a huge factor.
Right, there are distinct seasonal weeds. In the winter, the rabi season, you are fighting wild oats, bothu, and piazzi.
And piazzi translates to onion-like.
Which tells you exactly how it fights. If it's bulbous like an onion, it's sitting below ground hoarding massive amounts of water and nutrients before the wheat roots can even reach them.
It's stockpiling resources.
Exactly. And then summer hits, the kharif season, the battlefield changes, and suddenly you are fighting entirely different biological machines, things like Itsit, Dela, and Swank.
And they require completely different eradication strategies.
And the textbook offers a multi-stage defense plan that requires just as much precision as the soil mixing. The very first line of defense is using 100% pure seeds.
Which sounds simple, right?
It does, but if your wheat seed supply has even a fraction of a percent of wild oat seeds mixed into the bag, you are literally planting the enemy yourself.
It's preventative warfare. By ensuring purity before planting, you stop the invasion before it starts.
But the tactic that really blew my mind is crop rotation. We hear about this all the time, but the underlying mechanism is fascinating.
Oh, crop rotation is where farming elevates into psychological and environmental warfare.
Okay, break that down for me.
Think about the biological watch of a winter weed like bothu. Let's say a farmer plants wheat in the exact same field every single winter. The bothu weed adapts perfectly to the wheat's specific watering schedule, the fertilizer used, and the harvest time.
It syncs its watch with the farmer.
Completely sync. It knows exactly when the resources are coming.
Right.
But if the next winter, the farmer suddenly decides to plant something entirely different,
Like what?
say a crop that requires half as much water, or maybe one that is harvested a full month earlier, they disrupt the entire environment. The bothu weed wakes up expecting its usual routine, and instead finds an environment where it is parched and totally out of rhythm.
You change the rules of the game so the weed's adaptations are suddenly useless. That is brilliant.
It really is.
So, okay, the plants feed on the mathematically perfect soil, they survive the tactical onslaught of the weeds, but those crops don't exist in a vacuum.
No, they don't.
They are actually the fuel for the next tier of the agricultural ecosystem.
The livestock. The biological engines of the farm.
Yes. We transition from plant survival to animal energy. The textbook goes deep into the highly specialized livestock breeds of Pakistan.
And they are very specialized.
They are. And I couldn't help but compare these different cattle breeds to character classes in a role-playing video game.
A video game.
Yeah, think about it. Every breed has a hyper-specific, genetically honed purpose.
Ah, form follows function.
Exactly. You have your healer classes, the ones that provide nourishment, the Sahiwal and the Red Sindhi cattle. They are elite milk producers. Their bodies are physically designed to channel the calories they consume directly into massive udder production and high-quality milk.
But you wouldn't use a sahiwal to plow a field.
No way, because for that, you need the tank classes, the Dajjal and the Dani breeds. These are draft animals.
Right, built for labor.
They channel their calories entirely differently. They build dense bone structure and massive muscle mass. They are built for the pure, heavy labor of pulling a plow through that dense clay soil we talked about earlier.
And then you have the Thar-Parker breed.
Yes, the ultimate dual-purpose survivor that can pull a cart and give decent milk. That's your all-rounder class.
And this specialization extends to every animal on the farm, not just the cattle.
Oh yeah, the Neely Ravi buffalo is basically farm royalty.
It is.
It's famous for its visual characteristics. It has these distinct white markings on its face and legs and
Mhm.
walled or striking white eyes.
They're beautiful animals.
And then you have the small ruminants, teddy goats, which are the rapid breeders, the population multipliers, and sheep are literally categorized by their tail structure.
Yes, the Codgley and the Lohi breeds,
Right, they're divided into fat-tailed and thin-tailed varieties.
which is another extreme adaptation. A fat-tailed sheep stores its excess energy in its tail, very much like a camel stores fat in its hump.
That's amazing.
It allows the sheep to survive harsh, dry periods when fodder is scarce.
But here's the question that kept coming back to me as I was reading this. If you have all these highly specialized biological engines, the milk producers, the heavy lifters, the rapid breeders, how do they figure out the exact fuel mixture for them?
Ah, the diet.
Yeah, because you can't feed a high-performance draft animal the same diet you feed a milk cow.
You absolutely cannot. And this is where the textbook introduces precision nutrition. Animal feed is heavily calculated, and it's split into two major components: roughage and concentrates.
Okay, roughage and concentrates.
So roughage is your bulk material. It's the green fodder, the dry hay, the stalks.
The stuff we traditionally picture cows eating when we see them in a field.
Yes, exactly. And roughage is mechanically necessary because cattle and buffalo have complex digestive systems called rumens.
Right, the multiple stomachs.
Basically, yes,
Yeah.
a rumen is essentially a massive fermentation vat inside the animal. It's filled with microbes that break down plant matter.
Okay.
That vat needs scratchy, bulky hay to physically stimulate the stomach lining and keep the digestive process churning.
Okay, so the roughage keeps the engine running. What about the concentrates?
Well, the concentrates are the high-octane fuel. If you want a Neely Ravi buffalo to produce gallons of rich milk or a Donny bull to pull a heavy plow all day, they need dense calories.
So they can't just run on hay.
No, they'd burn out. Concentrates are things like grains and oil cakes.
Okay, I saw oil cakes in the text. What exactly is an oil cake? Is it baked?
Not baked, no. When farmers harvest a crop like mustard seeds or cotton seeds, humans crush those seeds to extract the oil for cooking or industrial use, right?
Yeah.
What's left behind is this dense, highly compressed hockey puck of pure protein and fiber. That leftover material is the cake.
Oh, wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the absolute genius of this traditional farming system reveals itself.
Because it's all connected.
Yes, the concentrates aren't just bought from some random factory somewhere. They are the direct byproducts of the very crops grown in the fields.
It is a perfectly closed zero-waste loop.
Exactly.
Let me just map this out. The perfect 45, 5, 25, 25 loam soil feeds the crops.
Yeah.
The crops provide grain and oil for human consumption.
Right.
The stalks and the leftover oil cakes become the roughage and concentrates to fuel the livestock.
The engines.
The highly specialized livestock burn that fuel to provide milk, or they provide the labor to pull the plows that turn the soil.
And finally,
And finally, the animal waste, the manure, is returned directly to the earth to replenish that critical 5% organic matter we started with.
the soil feeds the plants feed the animals feed the soil. It is a self-sustaining ecosystem running entirely on sunlight, water, and incredibly precise management.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive talking about blueprints and the clean, comforting math of skyscrapers. But honestly, the blueprint of a traditional farm is infinitely more complex.
It really is.
I mean, we went from understanding the strict 25% air requirement in a single handful of loam to this psychological crop rotation warfare against the bulbous piazzi weed, all the way to the specialized high-octane oil cake diet of a Neely Ravi buffalo.
It proves that there is no messy nature in agriculture. It is a biological masterclass.
It really is a masterclass.
Yeah.
I think the takeaway for you listening to this is that the next time you walk past a farm or even just look at a potted plant sitting on your windowsill with that little clay shard over the drainage hole, you shouldn't just see nature doing its thing.
Right. There's so much more going on beneath the surface.
You are looking at an active, highly managed science experiment that requires perfect mathematical balance and constant tactical adjustments just to survive.
It is a delicate balance that has been refined over thousands of years.
But you know, that actually leaves me with a final, maybe slightly unsettling thought to mull over.
Oh, what's that?
Well, the rules in this 6th grade textbook outline a traditional balance that has worked for centuries. But right now we are dealing with extreme, unprecedented weather shifts.
Oh, absolutely.
Climate change is actively altering average soil temperatures. It's changing water availability, causing those torrential floods one month and bone-dry droughts the next.
The baseline environment is shifting incredibly fast.
Exactly. The environment is changing the rules of the game faster than the plants can naturally adapt. So how will the foundational rules of this 10,000-year-old agricultural science have to adapt in the next few decades?
It's a daunting question.
If the environment can no longer guarantee the right temperature or predictable water levels, will that perfect golden ratio of soil soon become a thing of the past? We like the comfort of a clean architectural blueprint, but what happens when the ground underneath the skyscraper literally changes its chemistry?
The whole foundation shifts.
It's something to think about the next time you take a bite of it.